All right, so today we're going to do a little bit of reviewing from last week and getting some more practice with those new concepts we went over. So specifically our arrays, or in our game lab kind of spin-off of arrays, we got groups. So we'll be looking at those again today, and our for loop. So we're going to add those to a couple other places in our code, get a little more practice with those, go over those concepts again today. Okay. So as a reminder here, as we're getting started, let's go over what those actually are. So we're going to talk about our arrays first. Ooh, reloaded here. We'll give it just a second here. Come on, slides. There we go. So an array is just a collection of information or data, right? So you think about a variable, right? You got one item that you have in a variable. An array is a list, right? In fact, that's the word that they use in those code.org videos we watched last time, is list, right? So you have a series of items and they are in a specific order. They're not just kind of jumbled in a mess. They are kind of listed in order. Okay? Those are our arrays. Again, our game lab version of that are groups. They're going to look a little different, but we can do some of the same things with groups we can do with arrays, which is why we're talking about arrays, because arrays are very general. So anytime you're using JavaScript, or actually most coding languages, probably any coding language, you're going to be able to do the things with arrays that we're going to be doing. Groups are kind of specific to game lab, but we're going to, again, they've got some similar properties. Okay, so let's actually, before we go into our for loops, let's look at our array a little bit again. All right, so if I were going to create an array from scratch, and we haven't done this yet, we used our groups last time. We are going to create an array from scratch next time, but I want to kind of go over this again and start getting this in our brains, because we are going to do this next week. All right, so if I was going to create an array from scratch, just typing in my code, it would look something like this. So I would store it inside of a variable, right? So if I was creating it, I would use the var command. Oops, I'm not going to capitalize. There we go. And I would give it a name, same way I would with a variable, right? So maybe I'm going to call this list. And then I would do an equal sign to assign it a value. But with an array, to store more than one item, instead of just typing in the item, we're going to use our square brackets. So everything that is inside of that array is going to be contained within these square brackets. All right. So for example, if I wanted to store some numbers in this array, I could do 1, comma. So commas are going to separate our items. 2, comma, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So every item that I have, I put a comma between, and it's going to separate it between that one and the next one, right? So now my array here, or my list, is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items, right? I don't know why you're going to store just numbers 1 through 5 in here, but maybe you would. Now we can also store other things, not just numbers, such as string values. So instead of putting numbers, I'm going to just type in a couple strings here. So I'm going to say like maybe item 1, right? But it's going to be the same, right? So we put the string, make sure we have both of our quotes around that item, and then we put a comma to separate our items. And I'm going to say item 2. Make sure I put both quotes around there. Item 3. Oop, I did not put quotes around that, and I messed that up. Right, so I'm going to make this a little smaller so it fits inside of our. Ooh, help if I selected the text. There we go. All right, so now I have 3 items in this array, or my list right here, right? Okay, now one of the other things we saw with how to work with our arrays here is to use this dot length. So if I do list, type in the name of my array or my list, dot length, it's going to tell me how many items are in that array, right? So this is going to result in 3. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into Game Lab temporarily, just real quick into a blank game, so we can actually see this in the game itself. Go away, menu. Go away. All right, so I've already created a list that looks the same as what I just had typed up on my slide here. So I've created a list that has item 1, 2, and 3. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some console messages to give some stuff in the console, right? We're not even going to worry about displaying stuff over here in the game window. So I'm going to use a console.log, and I'm going to type in list dot length, right? And it's going to show me the value of what I put in the console logs, and it'll show up down here. So this should result in 1, 2, 3, because I have 3 items in there. I hit run, down to my console. I know it might be hard to see on your screen. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Boom. The number 3 shows up down here. This is way too zoomed in. Zoom out a little bit more. The number 3 right there. Okay. Now we can also do, so dot length is one of the things we learned about last time, and we did use that in our code, and we're going to use it again today. And that's again going to tell you how many items are in your list or your group, in the case of our groups in GameLab. Now, another thing we learned about is how to reference or how to like retrieve or refer to a single item in our list. And to do that, you type in the name of the list, in our case, or our array here. You type in the name. So we're going to type in list dot, or not dot, I'm sorry. That's not how we do it. We use our square bracket, and then we're going to refer to what they call the index number. And the index number is just the specific number of that item, right? The location of that item. So the spot in its order, right? So if I want to refer to the first item here, we're actually going to use, instead of list 1, we would say list 0. So our arrays start numbering things at number 0, right? So this is 0, this is 1, this is 2. So if I say list 0, that's going to give me item 1. And again, we're going to look at this in the console real fast. So got that. I'm going to bring another console message up. And I'm going to type in list square bracket 0. I'm going to hit run. And you can see down here in the console now, it is showing me item 1, right? If I say list 1, accept, run, it's showing me the second item, right? So this is item 0 or index 0. This is index 1. This is index 2, right? So I can see that one too. That's 2. And run. Item 3. There we go. Right, so that's how we refer to a specific item in a list. Now in groups, it's going to look a little bit different. If this were a GameLab group, the code that it's going to look like, and we'll see this more later. I can't put this in our GameLab example because I don't have it set up as a group right now. It would be list, or the group name, dot get, and I'm going to use parentheses instead of our square brackets, 0. So if I'm using groups, this is how it's going to look. So the name of the list, or the name of the, name of the group, dot get, and its index number, right? So this and this would both give me item 1, right? So this is how we do it with regular old arrays, and this is how we do it with groups. Okay. All right, so that's how we refer to specific items in our group or list. Now, let's go and talk about our for loops again. Let's go and revisit those real fast. Get a little bit of reminder. So our for loop is a loop, so it's code that's going to run over and over, or repeats. But our for loops have 3 things that we need to set. So 1 is the beginning point. 2 is where is this loop going to end, or how many times is it going to run? And 3 is what we call the increment, or as they put it down here in the fancy coding terms, the step interval. How much is this counter going to change every time this loop runs? So we're going to see this in action. I know that putting it this way can be a little confusing. So let's actually see it in action here. So I'm going to come back to my console. I'm going to get rid of this console log here. I mean, my game. Get rid of that console log. I'm going to go ahead and drag a for loop in here. All right. So on our for loop, again, we have these 3 different items, right? So this is our starting point. And to use our starting point, we're going to use a variable that's going to be just kind of contained within our loop. So because we're creating it up here at the top, this variable is only going to exist in our loop. Okay. Now, the normal way that these are going to be often called is using the letter I. So a lot of times when you use for loops, it's just going to use the letter I as your variable name. Not always, but for our purposes right now, we're just going to stick with that, okay? So the most common way to set this up is to set I to 0 as its initial value. Okay, so you create this variable I, give it a value of 0. The next one is, when is this loop going to stop? And this loop is going to run as long as I is less than 4. So if we don't change anything else and we use a classic setup for a for loop, this number right here is how many times our loop is going to run. Okay, so this is really the only thing we're going to be changing about this for loop right now. I'm explaining the different parts, but this number right here is the only thing you really got to get in your brains, is that's how many times my loop is going to repeat. This last part is how much does I increase or increment every time the loop starts over. And I plus plus means increase I by 1. Okay, we looked at this last time. This is like almost the same thing as saying like I equals I plus 1. Okay. I plus plus, that's what it means. Increase I 1 by 1 every time this loop finishes running. Okay, so what this is going to do is the first time that this loop runs, I is equal to 0. And it's going to run until I is, as long as I is less than 4. So I is equal to 0. It's going to run. The loop finishes. It's going to increase I by 1, right? So now the second time when it's getting ready to run, now I is 1. And it's going to check, is I still less than 0? Or, I'm sorry, less than 4. Is I still less than 4? Yes. Okay, so now I'm going to run the code again. All right, now loop gets to the end. It's going to increase I by 1 again. So now I is equal to 2. It's going to check. Is I less than 4 still? Yes. Okay, going to run again. At the end of that loop, it's going to increase I by 1 again. So now it's 3. Is I less than 4? Yes. Okay. Run the code. Now it's going to be, finishes the loop, increases I by 1. It's 4. Is I less than 4? No. Okay. Well, then we're done. All right. So one way to look at this is to do this right here. So I'm going to put a counsel statement in my for loop, and I'm going to come back to this list in a second. But I'm just going to have it print in my counsel log the value of I. So every time that this runs, it's going to show me the value of what I is. Okay. I'm going to go ahead, reset. I'm going to run. We're going to look at the results in our counsel down here. And there we go, right? So I have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So the first time that this loop ran, I was 0, right? And it printed it to the counsel, goes over again. Now I is equal to 1, starts over again. Now it's equal to 2, starts over again, equal to 3. Once it finishes that loop, right, it's going to increase I again. It comes up and it checks, is I less than 4? No, because it's equal to 4. So stop running. Okay, so again, this is kind of the how long, how many times we're going to run. All right. So now we're going to bring together our arrays and our for loop. And specifically, I'm going to tell this to run the same number of times that I have items in my array. So I will use that dot length here. So I'm going to type in list dot length. So now this is going to run, or it's going to loop as many times as I have items in that list. So as I add items to that list, as I take items away, it's going to run that many times. However many times things are in that list at that exact moment, that's how many times it's going to loop. Okay, so this is very helpful because oftentimes in your code, you don't necessarily know how long your list is or your group is going to be, how many items are in your group, right? You might be taking things out in your code, re-adding things in your code. So this is a very commonly used thing here. So run the loop for as many times as I have in my list. so I can kind of cycle through and check different things, right? All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, I'm going to go into my console log. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to print everything that's in my list. So I'm going to run this loop over and over again. And every time this loop runs, I'm going to have it print to my console list I. So list and then I. So again, this is what it's going to do. Remember, going back to this slide here, your array name with the number in square brackets is going to give us the item at that location, right? At that index value, that index location. So 0 is going to give us the first item, 1 is going to give us the second item, and 2 is going to give us the third, right? Oop, that's not the right window. Here we go. So what this is going to do is every time this runs, it's going to do list and then put in the value of whatever I is here. And it's going to run for as many items as we have in our list. So if I hit run right now, it's going to basically result in cycling through every item in my list. So this is the principle we've been using with our groups, right? In order to check every item in a group, this is similar to how we would set it up. And we did set it up and we will be setting it up. Okay. So we can do list I, it's going to print out every single item in our array. Okay. So this is a little bit of a recap and showing us in a little bit different way as well, both those arrays and our for loops from last time. Now, we're still using groups in GameLab, and we're going to keep using groups. We are going to use a straight up regular array next time. Okay, so keep this kind of set up in your head for now. But we also need to kind of adjust how we're doing things a little bit to work with groups, because groups function a little differently. Remember, we saw here, we got that little bit of a difference in how we have to refer to specific items, for example. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up our game. We can kind of remember where we're at here. So last class, we added a second enemy. Right? We talked about groups, and we added that collision detection for our second enemy by using our group. Okay, so let's actually look at what that code looked like. Not going to go over all of our code again. So we did use, for example, this is where we set up the group, where we created it. And when we added our enemies, right, we learned how to apply properties or change things across the entire group, such as set scale each, set rotation each. So this is the code we actually modified, though. Our biggest kind of point here where we actually use those for loops. And that was in our enemies collide function. So we use a for loop to cycle through every enemy in our group. So again, we use that enemies.length to do that. We determine how many items are in this group. Okay, now we're going to do something for each one of them, right? And what we did for every enemy in that group is we said if enemies.get I, so get the enemy that's at the value of whatever I is, right, is touching player. So if that specific enemy is touching the player, destroy that enemy and subtract 1 from lives. So that is a recap of what we did last time. Today, what we're going to do is we are going to use that same kind of setup so that we can actually have our change our shoot function so we can actually detect if our blast is touching every enemy in that group as well. Okay, so right now, for example, I can shoot enemy 1. I cannot shoot enemy 2, right? It just goes through it. I could code it from scratch and do enemy 2, enemy 3, however many enemies I add, but I don't want to do that, right? I'm going to use this same setup to check that. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to add. We're also going to be adding a score to this to kind of count how many enemies we've blown up. And then we're going to add a wraparound function so that if enemies go off the edge of the screen, because now we're adding more enemies, we might be too much to try to shoot at one time. As enemies go off the screen, they're going to show back up on the other side, and they're just going to loop around. So we're going to start by modifying our shoot function. All right. So the top part of this function is actually, we don't have to touch it. So this is just setting up that the blast itself. So when we hit the space bar and we have the ability to shoot, have that blast come out of our ship, right? This is if it's if our blast goes off the edge of the screen, kind of reset our ability to shoot, right? What we need to change is the collision, detecting that collision between the blast and the enemy. So that's down here. So this is the only part we have to change in our shoot function. So if you set yours up the same way as me, I'm all the way at the bottom of my code right now. I'm actually going to leave this if statement for now. We are going to end up getting rid of this, but I'm going to leave it for the moment so I can use it as a reference. All right. So just like we did our collision detection with our just general enemies, like is our enemy hitting our player, we're going to use our for loop. So that is the first thing I'm going to drag in. So I'm going to go to control. I'm going to drag in a for loop, and I'm going to put it at the bottom of my function here, right below my if statement. And I want this to cycle through my whole enemies group. So I need it to run for as many times as I have items in that group. So I'm going to use go to my middle number here, which is my counter. Right? How many times is this running? And I'm going to say enemies dot length. As long as I is less than enemies dot length, run this loop. Okay. All right, so now I've got that. Now I'm going to set up my if statement inside. My if statement is going to look pretty similar to how this one works, just I need to change it to be working with my groups instead of an individual specific item. So I am going to start with an if statement. And I am going to drag in this is touching block, so it's a little less confusing for us. Is touching, there it is. All right, and I'm going to leave the blast in the first part because we are checking to see if the blast is checking it. All right, now what I'm going to change though is the second part. So instead of listing a specific enemy, I want to check the enemy that's at this specific index inside of my group. Okay. So the way I type that again is I'm going to type in enemies dot get. Should zoom out a little bit so we can actually see this whole line of code here. Enemies.get parenthesis, oops, that's the number 9, parenthesis, I. And make sure that I is within a set of parentheses, right? It's in the middle. And this is going to tell me the enemy at the position I inside of my group, right? So the first time this runs, it's going to give me enemies.get 0, which is going to be the first enemy in my group. Next time it runs, enemies.get 1, it's going to give me the second enemy in my group. So I'm going to check to see if blast is touching enemies.get I. And if it is, first thing I want to do is destroy that enemy, right? So I'm still under sprites. I'm going to find the destroy block. Of course, you can always type all the stuff in from scratch if you want to, but I think this might be a little less confusing to do it this way. Where is destroy? Destroy, there it is, towards the bottom. So if blast is touching that enemy, I want to destroy that enemy. So I'm going to type in the same thing I typed in here. Enemies dot get parenthesis I. And there we go. And this will kind of some of these when we're typing them in, when we're typing kind of like these slightly more elaborate lines of code, sometimes code.org will kind of look like they're locking those in. So remember, if at any point in time you want to just modify it, obviously you can just delete it by dragging off the block. But if you need to modify it and it does something like this, you can always go show text and change it from here. Now remember though, if you make any critical errors when you're in show text, it won't let you switch back to blocks, which I know has happened to some people before. You'll have to fix it before you can switch back if you make a critical error. Okay, So I've got, it's going to destroy the enemy if they're touching. So that's first thing. Now the rest of this is going to be the same, right? Because none of this has to do with the enemy itself. It has to do with the blast, right? So this first one is going to change my blast X location. It's going to take it from wherever it's at on the screen and move it 450X, which is going to be off screen. Same thing with Y. It's going to make sure it's kind of centered here, not like way up here or way down here. It's going to take it, kind of plop it off screen in the kind of like vertically in the middle. So we can't see it. This next one's going to stop it, right? Setting my velocity Y, my Y velocity, which it was moving before, right? It was going up. It's going to set that velocity Y to 0, so it stops moving. And then it's going to reset that can shoot variable to true, which is going to allow me to shoot again. So since I have all these lines of code set up, there's no reason to recode them. I'm just going to drag these down into the if statement here. So I've got these all in here. Now I can get rid of this original if statement. I don't need this one anymore, and I can delete it, get rid of it. Okay. So now if this works, if I've coded this correctly, when I hit run, I should be able to run into, oh, I'm sorry, that wasn't even what I did. I did the blast. I should be able to shoot both my enemies. That was the key. Okay, enemy 1 and 2. Got them both. There we go. So now the blast is being detected on every enemy in my enemies group. Okay. All right, so now we've implemented that process again. Now we're going to make one change here. And the one change we're going to make is adding a score variable. So right now we have our lives variable that shows in the top screen. We're going to add a score that's going to show in the other corner. Okay. And it's going to keep track of how many enemies we've managed to blow up. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a score variable. So I'm going to put that all the way at the top. And the exact location isn't too important, but I'm going to put it right underneath my lives variable. I think that's organizationally makes sense to me. So I'm going to create a score. I'm going to set the initial score to 0. All right. Now I need to add the text that's going to display my score. So this is going to be similar to how I did lives up here. So we haven't looked at that in a while, and that was the only time we really used it. So we'll briefly recap how we did that. Just scroll down to where that is in my code. It's right here in my draw function. And it was all this stuff here. So this is all under the drawing group or category here. So we've got a whole bunch of blocks that deal with various things having to do with text. Yes, so when I set up the variable, I just created it at the top. Exact location doesn't matter. I put it right under lives. And I use the declaring and assignments, right? So you're creating the variable and you're giving it a value. And I did var score equals 0. All right, so now I'm down here and we're looking at our text. So when we set up our little lives label up here, right, that's how we did it, right? So I used a few to do my setup, right? So the first one I used was text size. And again, these are under drawing here. Text size, change the size of the font. Fill does the color. This is like if you want to change the font itself, which I did. I typed in the impact, right? So only load fonts that are already on your computer. Impacts, it was a really easy one. You got to type in the exact name. So it, impact's easy to remember. So that's part of the reason I used it right here. And then you display that text using just this text command. So I displayed lives plus the value of that lives variable right here. And then this is the X and Y positioning of that text. All right. So since I already set up my text, I don't need to do that again. I'm just going to use another text command. And I'm going to put it right underneath where I did my lives. And the first thing I want this to say is just like how I had this one show the word lives, right? It's going to actually put that on the screen. I'm going to type in score similarly here. score colon. Oh, actually, colon space. I think I like better. Ooh, the game's running. That's fine. So I'm gonna do score colon space. Then I'm gonna move to the other side of my quotation mark. Make sure I'm on the right-hand side. I'm gonna hit a space. I'm gonna hit plus. And then I'm gonna show the value of the score variable. So it's gonna show the word score with a colon. Then I'm gonna show the value of that score variable next to it. And when I click off, it's gonna look almost identical to the lives up here. Right, so you've got the string or the word score plus the value of score. All right. The next two bit of code here is my X and Y coordinate. So my Y, I'm going to leave the same as I had this one. So I'm going to set this to 25. This is how far down the text is going to be, right? My Y is my vertical. So I'm going to have it down just a little bit from the top. And my X here, the first one was set at 5. So it's like right just a little bit over from the edge. This one's going to be a lot higher because I want it all the way over on the other side of the screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and put in a number here because your screen is 400 wide, remember? So I'm going to type in like 300 and see what it looks like. Reset. I'm going to hit run now. And there we have my score over here. If I wanted it to be as tight as this one, I could probably play around with this a little bit, like maybe 325. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, too much. 310. That's pretty close, but if I get into double digits, it might move around. You know, I'm just going to leave it at 300. I think 300 is a good number. All right. And there we go. So now my score is currently 0. And right now that score is not doing anything at all, right? I'm not increasing it anywhere in my code. So if I shoot things, my score doesn't go up. Right? So I created the variable. I created the text. Now I need to create the method for when that score will increase. And I want it to increase when I shoot an enemy. So that's where I'm going to add that one line of code in I'm going to need here. So I'm going to go down to where the code we just modified, right? And we've got that for loop with the if statement inside. And I'm going to add one more line of code to it. And that is going to be my variable assignment. Make sure you're using this one. Make sure you're not using var, because var is only when you create a variable the first time, right? So I'm going to go and put this inside of that if statement, and I'm going to make it score is going to get the value of score plus 1. So every time I destroy an enemy, right, my blast hits an enemy, it's touching. It's going to do all this stuff, and then it's going to increase score by 1. It'll increase. So if I test this and I shoot my enemy, boom, now I got a score 1. Right, let's see if I can get a score 2 here. There we go. Score 2. All right. So now that's all we have to do for shoot. We've got shoot pretty much set up. We've got our score working. We've got our lives working, right? So now we're going to add one more new function for today, and it's going to give us a little more practice using those for loops and referencing our group items, right, to cycle through everything in a group. So I'm going to create one more function. That is just if my enemies go off the edge of the screen, right? If I move off the edge, I want them to show back up on the other side. I want them to be able to wrap around the level, right? We did this in our App Lab project. It's going to be a little bit easier to implement here, but we are going to use the for loop in the group again. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a function. And I'm going to drag a function with no parameter, no input here to the bottom to create a new function. And I'm going to call this function just wraparound. And again, I want to start with a lowercase letter w, but around I'm going to have a capital. That's just following our good naming conventions. Now, what I'm going to do here is I want to check to see if the enemy has gone off the edge of the screen, right? So if remember our X and our Y coordinates, X is 0 on the left-hand side, right? And it increases as we go right. Y is 0 at the top and increases as we go down. The dimensions of our game screen in Game Lab are 400 wide, 400 tall, right? So if something is at 400, 400, that's going to be in the bottom right-hand corner, right? Our X would be 400 all the way on the edge then, and our Y would be 400, meaning all the way at the bottom, right? We don't need to worry about our X for this case because we're not going to have to be going off the right or the left edge of the screen. We're only going to worry about if it's going off the bottom. So that's the only thing we need to check. So we want to check, basically see if that item is beyond that 400 point for our Y value. But we want to check to see if every item in our enemies group has gone off the screen, right? We want to cycle through the same way we did up here. So we're going to use a for loop for it. And we're going to set it up pretty similarly to how we set this one up, right? So I'm going to do control, for loop. I'm going to put it inside my wraparound. And I'm going to have this, again, cycle through everything in my group here. So I'm going to use that for my the length of that group for my how many times it's going to repeat. Enemies dot length. That's the only thing, again, I have to change about my for loop. So, all right, so I got my for loop set up. Now I want to check if each individual item in that group, each enemy, if their Y value is greater than, I'm going to say 450. So it's where I'm going to know that it's totally off the edge of the screen. If I say greater than 400, maybe it'll kind of like clip where it'll kind of look like it's not quite off the edge and then it'll show back up. So I'm going to give it a little bit of extra. So I'll say like 450. So I'm going to see if its Y is greater than 450. So first thing is I'm checking a condition, right? So I'm going to use an if statement. And I'm going to use just an if because there's no else. There's no like alternative if that's not true. I don't want it to do anything. I'm just going to use just an if. And I'm going to just type this whole thing in. So I'm not going to use any other blocks. I'm just going to type this command in. And so first I want to use that enemies.getI to reference that specific item in my group that is at location for whatever my I value is. I'm going to do enemies.get I. So that's going to retrieve the specific enemy that's at the location of whatever my I is at. So the first time 0, right? So my get 0. So it'll be the first thing. And I want to know if the Y value for this enemy is greater than 450. So I'm going to say enemies.getI dot Y. And that's how in Game Lab we retrieve that Y location. Again, remember, space greater than 450. Then I can click out. Now remember, this did what it did up above there, where it kind of, once I typed it in, it turns into a solid block. I can't edit that. So if you make a typo in here, let's say you spelled enemies wrong, and you can't change it here, you can always go to show text, and you can modify that here. Okay. So if the enemy that we're cycling through, its Y location is greater than 450, all I want it to do is take that Y location, right? Because now it's gone off the edge of the screen. I want to move it so that it's back up at the top. So for this, we can start with a block if we want to, right? So I can go to sprites, and I can use this sprite.y because I'm going to change its Y location. And instead of sprites, I'm going to type in, again, enemies.getI. .get I. And that'll give me that specific enemy that I'm cycling through. It's going to give me its Y, or it's going to let me set its Y location. And I'm going to set it so that it's, if I set it right at 0, it might be like kind of show up partially on screen. I'm going to set it a little bit above. So I can do like negative, maybe 10. Start it just a little bit above the top of the screen. All right, so if its location is greater than 450, it's off the edge. Now I'm going to move it so it's at the top. That's all this is going to do. So the last thing I have to do here is I've set up my function. I have to actually call or run that function now. Scroll up. I'm going to do that again inside of my draw loop where I ran my other functions. Go to functions. And I'm going to put it right below where I put shoot. Make sure you're using to call a function, not create a function, right? And I'm going to call it. Now make sure when you're typing this in, I'm going to type in, oh, see, I almost did it. Wrap around. And make sure you're typing it in exactly, right? Your name, you got to type that name in exactly. That was something I saw a lot on our App Lab projects when a common mistake, people would make typos here. So especially with the wrap versus warp. So sometimes you put wrap around in one spot, warp around in another spot. You will get an error. So make sure you're checking for those. Right? If you're getting those yellow errors, that means number one thing to check if you're getting a yellow error and you think you got all your code in is check for a typo. Don't ignore those yellow errors. Some people just were like, hey, Mr. G, I'm done. And I looked at it and I was like, you got like 8 yellow errors. You got to check your spelling. Right. So wrap around. Now when I'm going to test this and see if it works. I'm going to move out of the way, let them both go off the screen. And there we go. So now these will loop over and over again until I shoot one or run into one. All right, so this is all the new code we're adding for today. So we got a little bit more practice with those arrays and groups, as well as that for loop. So just to recap everything that we added to our code today. We modified our shoot function to cycle through every enemy in our enemies group. And to do that, we used our for loop and this enemies.getI to reference each individual enemy that's at this location, right? Then we added our score variable. So we added the declared it at the top. We created it, declared it at the top. Added that text inside of our draw function. And we did that right under where we did our text for our lives label. Made sure we added that code to increase our score if we shoot our enemy, right? That's how our score is going to go up. Then we created our wraparound function. And a wraparound function, again, just giving us a little more practice with that for loop, with those referencing specific items in our groups, using enemies.getI again. And then we also need to make sure there, after we created our function, you do also need to make sure you call or run your function. So we just added that right there. And that is now up to date. Oops, I ran into that one. Oh, no, I did. I shot it. I thought I ran into it. Nice. Okay, so this is all we have for today. Next week, we are going to be, again, doing a little bit more things a little newer again. So this was giving us a little practice of what we did last week, using it a little more, adding a little more using that function. Next week, we're going to be sticking with these concepts. We are going to be using our for loops and our group still, but we're going to do things a little different, right? Because this is a pretty short game right now. I shot 2 enemies and that's it, right? We're going to use another type of loop to actually create some randomness to our game, to create different types of enemies, using different graphics. And every time we kill all of our enemies, we're going to have them respawn. So that's kind of where we're going with this. All right. Any questions? All right. Well, we have about 20 minutes left, a little less than 20 minutes. So I'm going to let you go back and work on wherever you left off on this. So I know a lot of people are not caught up, not up to date. So go back and watch those videos. Start putting some progress in here. Not fall behind, right? Because it's going to keep stacking up pretty quickly if you get behind. So make sure we're staying up pace. And also, then you'll have a chance to ask questions, right? So whether you're working on that or if you're up to date and you're like, hey, Mr. G, I don't want to wait for the video of this and I got this question here, you can go ahead and ask that now too. Okay. So you can go ahead and start working on your own, and just let me know if you have any questions.